The Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies was founded more than 30 years ago based on the following premise: fear, ignorance, and contempt that exists between people cannot be left unchecked, but requires action. We can, and indeed we must, work to reduce prejudice in our communities. We can, and we must, work to preserve human dignity in our society. At the ICJS, our work has never been more urgent. We are at an important moment in our country's story and a transitional moment for our organization. At ICJS, we are both thinking carefully and doing some soul searching about how anti-Black racism intersects with our efforts to confront anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. We seek to lift up the promise and possibility of interfaith responses to white supremacy. With the recent tragedy at the Tree of Life Synagogue, the shootings in Kentucky targeting African American Christians, and the physical attacks on Muslims and those perceived to be Muslim, we are reminded of the urgency of our work. And at the end of 2018, we are challenged to live out our mission in these uncertain times, because they are indeed our times. In this current environment, the ICJS is exploring, as well as interrogating, the distinction between theological and political work, about the role of interfaith organizations and interfaith alliances in confronting religious and racial bigotry. That is why we are so honored to spend the evening learning with Dr. Beverly Mitchell. Beverly Mitchell was called to the faculty of Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. in July of 1998. She teaches courses in historical, systematic, and contextual theology, church history, including African American religious history, and human rights. She's the author of numerous journal articles, book chapters, and 2 books: Black Abolitionism, The Quest for Human Dignity, and Plantations and Death Camps, Religion, Ideology, and Human Dignity. Her more recent scholarship has focused on the challenges to human dignity in the face of white supremacy, economic injustice, and genocide. I have had the great privilege of getting to know Dr. Mitchell through the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Committee on Religion, Ethics, and the Holocaust, and I've had the honor of sharing meals and ideas over the last year as we prepared for your visit here in Baltimore. It is a new friendship that I'm very grateful for. Tonight's Manekin-Clark lecture reminds us that the ICJS was forged on the basis of friendships that not so long ago would have been unimaginable in Baltimore. Bernie Manekin, one of the founding Jewish trustees of the ICJS, was a man who became entangled in the lives of those that he came to know and to love, and Bernie's affections were not limited by religious affiliation. Jim Clark, a Presbyterian mensch known to many of you, was a builder who wanted to change the inner as well as the outer landscape of America. Jim was one of the people who came into Bernie's orbit, and the gravitational pull of Bernie's personality was irresistible. A lifelong friendship was forged, and while neither Bernie nor Jim are with us on this earth, the Manekin-Clark lecture bears witness to their deep and resilient relationship. The Manekin-Clark lecture is an expression of Bernie and Jim's belief that we belong to one another despite our differences, that Baltimoreans of all faiths can challenge one another to live in ways that deepen our respective commitments and strengthen our community. While I did not have the privilege to know either man, I trust that both would have been among the first to recognize the need to affirm the dignity of the most vulnerable among us in this critical hour. We are fortunate to have with us a good representation of both Jim and Bernie's families, and I would ask them to stand and be recognized as we honor the power of friendship across difference to be a force for good in our community. So if you would please stand. I'm concluding my introduction by recognizing the Emmanuel Episcopal Church community, and in particular the congregants who volunteered to help us tonight, and to Reverend Joseph Wood and Reverend Jim Holmes. We are grateful for your warm and gracious hospitality this evening. Institutional friendships and community partnerships are pivotal to a healthy city and to a good community. It is with deep gratitude that I also recognize WYPR and Tom Hall, who hosted Dr. Mitchell on midday last week. And it is in the spirit of friendship that we welcome to the podium Dr. Beverly Mitchell, who will be giving a lecture entitled White Supremacy, Power, and the Role of Interfaith.
Good evening. I want to thank Dr. Heather Miller Rubens, Executive Director of the Institute of Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies, for inviting me. It's a real privilege to be asked to speak about something that both burdens my heart, but also energizes me to resist. We're at a critical moment in the history of our country as we reckon with the threat of white supremacy becoming more mainstream. Critical moments bring remarkable opportunities, though, and it's with that I come with a measure of hope. The ideology of white supremacy, which undergirds anti-Black racism, racial anti-Semitism, and anti-Muslim sentiment, is rearing its head in ways that leave all of us vulnerable. Those of the Abrahamic faiths and other traditions are being afforded the opportunity to answer the call to bear witness to an alternative vision of our life together. The election of Barack Obama to the US presidency in 2008 did not usher in a post-racial era. Instead, violent outbursts from white supremacists have ratcheted up in the last 10 years. For some, the election of the first African-American president symbolized the impending loss of a white majority population. Near the end of Obama's first term, we saw just how exorcised some whites have been about the direction of this country. On a Sunday morning in August of 2012, Wade Page walked into a Sikh temple and opened fire on the worshipers, killing 6 and injuring 4. The irony is that these Sikhs were largely targeted because they were mistaken for Muslims. Page had been radicalized by white power literature and music while in the army. The principal targets of the racial fury of white supremacy remain Blacks and Jews, but Muslims are increasingly threatened as they've become racialized. Although other minority groups have been racialized and discriminated against, Blacks remain the quintessential symbol of non-whiteness. Anti-Jewish sentiment, once a reflection of religious bigotry, has shape-shifted in the last 200 years into racial anti-Semitism. White supremacist groups carry other hatreds, but at the top of their list are Blacks and Jews. White supremacy is an overarching ideology that covers various expressions of racism. Whether we're speaking of racism toward Blacks and other racial ethnic groups, racial anti-Semitism, or anti-Muslim prejudice, these virulent forms of social exclusion bear characteristics of racialization that have been imposed by white societies. we can no longer view them as separate phenomena, but must understand them as expressions of white dominance that are interrelated because they are spawned by the same father. The fact that they are interrelated, though, offers a theological basis upon which diverse religious communities might band together for a common cause. And I'll unpack that assertion a little later. It's important for me to emphasize that to critique white supremacy is not to demonize people whose skin color happens to be white, for they too are fellow human beings made in the image of God and endowed with the dignity that comes from this. Unfortunately, some whites have difficulty in making the distinction between white skin and whiteness. Consequently, they experience the critique of white supremacy as being anti-white people or even racist. And this is regrettable because that misperception precludes the kind of consciousness raising necessary for genuine transformation in our communal life together. I assert emphatically that being a white person or a person with white skin is not evil, but clinging to the ideology of white supremacy is. It's an ideology that creeps into every corner of our society, into the economic, social, cultural, and political realms. It's reflected in the enforcement of our laws. It's reflected in our criminal justice system. It can shape the types of jobs to which we have access, the amount of money we can make, where we live, and the schools we attend. It has even infected our religious lives. It shapes how we view ourselves and how we view others. This is what ideologies do. Whether we acknowledge its presence or not, whether we want to be part of it or not, we are all entangled in it and implicated. Recent events have made it more difficult to pretend that the elephant isn't in the room, for the stench of its droppings are starting to smell. As ethnographer Ronald Takaki has written, race is a social construct produced by the dominant group in society and reflects their power to define and impose the boundaries of group membership based upon race. White supremacy works that way, even though it has no basis in science. More than 100 years ago, the anthropologist Franz Boas argued that since there is nothing biologically real about the classification of race, its existence requires that people collectively agree and accept that the notion of race exists, and we buy into it. This statement could be a cause for sorrow or rejoicing. The sorrow is that collectively the dominant group, which decides who's in and who's out, empowers itself and disempowers others, uses race as a marker of status and works hard to maintain its own. That's where the sorrow is. But the joy of Boaz's assertion is that if people collectively agree and accept and buy into race, they can also stop buying into it, thereby claiming their freedom. Theologically, white supremacy is antithetical to the Christian gospel. It violates the concept of siblinghood, that we are sisters and brothers within one human family, and that our relatedness imposes an ethical imperative upon us to love each other and to refrain from doing each other harm. To elevate one's own group as superior and to reduce others to a subordinate status is idolatrous and a violation of the scriptural commandment to love one's neighbor. There can be no true justice under these circumstances. This country has been plagued by white dominance since its inception. It's time to let freedom finally ring. White supremacy reveals itself in two ways. There's the subtle, though pervasive expression of it that's so sweeping that some of us hardly notice it. Robin DiAngelo, a scholar of white studies, has offered the following statistics which convey what I'm describing. Have you noticed the following? Have you noticed that 90% of our Congress is white? 96% of our governors are white. 100% of our top military advisors are white. 91% of our current cabinet is white. 93% of the people who decide which TV shows we see are white. 90% of the people who decide which books we read are white. 85% of the people who decide which news is covered are white. 95% of the people who decide which music is produced is white. 83% of our nation's teachers are white. 90% of the people who own pro football teams are white. What does this tell you when you reflect on these statistics? And in reflecting on this data that's not alternative facts, DiAngelo concludes, and I agree, that this speaks to the degree of power, control, and dominance by one racial group with a particular self-image, worldview, and set of interests which permeate our society. The second way in which white supremacy manifests itself can be seen in the way in which we have been forced to reckon with the degree to which a growing number of whites who don't feel they've been able to reap the benefits of white dominance have become radicalized. They view minorities as the cause of their misery. What we saw in Charlottesville last year did not suddenly arise out of thin air. This form of white supremacy has been present for a long time. Submerged underground after the civil rights movement, it's resurfaced with a vengeance, reminding us of just how violent racial hatred can be. Because of this radical form of white supremacy has come out of the woodwork, we can truly see the folly of proposing that the U.S. has entered a post-racial era. Perhaps now we can wake up and get to the work to dismantle this ideology once and for all. The Unite the Right rally of white nationalists, KKK, alt-righters, and other white identity groups in Charlottesville was part of a general protest of the removal of statues celebrating heroes of the Confederacy. Counter-protesters came to protest the actions and rhetoric of a mob from places beyond Charlottesville who were hell-bent on celebrating a disgraceful era of United States history in the name of protecting their white pro-slavery heritage. Not only did the Unite the Right rally participants have a beef with African Americans, they also had a beef with Jews. In fact, they perceived blacks and Jews as the two crucial enemies of their cause. More than a century ago, white supremacists in Europe and the United States recasted the caricature of the Jew as a money-grubbing religious menace to a racialized one. In the white nationalist imagination, Jews are a race, the race that presents a direct existential threat to whiteness. The white nationalists in Charlottesville brandished torches and chanted anti-Semitic and Nazi slogans, including blood and soil, and Jews will not replace us, all crafted to cast Jews as foreign interlopers, read non-white, who need to be expunged. The attendees proudly displayed giant swastikas and wore shirts bearing quotes of Adolf Hitler. Reportedly, one banner even read, "Jews are Satan's children." James Fields Jr., the man recently convicted of mowing down protesters in August 2017, killing Heather Heyer and injuring 19, was said to have a fascination with Nazism and Adolf Hitler. As civil rights strategist Eric K. Ward contends, anti-Semitism is not a sideshow to racism within white nationalist thought. Rather, it's the fuel that white nationalist ideology uses to power its anti-black racism, its contempt for all people of color, and its xenophobia. Holders of this ideology at Charlottesville reason that Jews are operating behind the scenes to manipulate the social order. Jews who are supposedly controlling television, banking, entertainment, education, and even Washington, D.C., must be orchestrating the push to destroy symbols of white identity. This Jewish conspiracy must be brainwashing white people, rendering them racially unconscious. This is what we're dealing with. Journalist Emma Green, covering the tragedy in Charlottesville, makes a similar point to that of Ward, noting that there's no question that the Charlottesville demonstration was suffused with both anti-Black sentiment and racial anti-Semitism. Marchers displayed banners with vile accusations about Charlottesville being run by, quote, Jewish communists and criminal niggers, unquote. Yes, they went there. While defending the memory of Robert E. Lee, a man committed to the preservation of an economic system perpetuating the enslavement of people of African descent, the white nationalists were wearing shirts that extolled the virtues of Adolf Hitler. Anti-Blackness and racial anti-Semitism as expressions of white supremacy have long been intertwined in our country. This ideology of racialism spreads outward to all groups who are perceived as non-white. Hence, no one outside the narrow perimeter of whiteness is safe. Immigrants from non-white majority countries and other minority groups are vulnerable. Thus, the same racialism we have seen of Jews has happened to Muslims in this country. Anti-Muslim bigotry is not new in the United States either. However, as a consequence of the war on terror, it's been given a new face. Muslims, in reality, are not monolithic. They vary racially, ethnically, and culturally. But in the eyes of anti-Muslims, their differences are dissolved, and they are cast as potentially threatening people based upon perceived racial and cultural characteristics. The Pew Center, relying on FBI statistics, reports that assaults on Muslims have surpassed post-9/11 levels. In 2016 alone, acts of violence and nonviolent harassment of Muslims rose by 57%. News outlets give considerable coverage to crimes by Muslims. Out of more than 1,000 Hollywood films depicting Arabs/Muslims, because they are often conflated, 932 out of 1,000 of them, these films, depict them in a stereotypical or negative light. Television and other media follow suit. Even political cartoonists represent generic Muslims the same way. Brown-skinned males with oversized noses, wearing beards and turbans. In terms of this shift from anti-Muslim sentiment being based on religion to becoming something that's racialized, sociologist Maytha Al-Hassan notes that whenever she has spoken to the media, there's been a distinct interest in looking at Islam as those brown people from over there. And she adds that many stories surrounding attacks on Sikhs, a religion which originated in India, are often mistaken for Muslims because they wear turbans. And for her, and I think she has a point here, this provides additional indications that anti-Muslim hatred is not focused on an understanding of Islam as a religion, but rather as a way to perceive Muslims as culturally and ethnically other. Nevertheless, the idea that anti-Muslim sentiment is racist is contested by some scholars and cultural critics. They deny the racialization of Muslims and want to reduce the difficulties that they experience to religious hostility. However, another sociologist and an interfaith activist, Craig Considine, effectively argues, when you do this, when you fail to take into account the racial dimension of what's going on in terms of prejudice against Muslims, what we see are Muslims being pathologized, homogenized, and stripped of all aspects of their individuality, and they're being presented as the alien other. This is how racialism works. Unless countermeasures are taken, it's inevitable that we will continue to see populations racialized by rendering them non-white and therefore viewing them as a threat to white dominance. The recent debacle at our southern border bears this out. We were told by the current administration that the caravans that came from Mexico, through Mexico, contained rapists, gang members, and even Muslim terrorists, ready to storm our borders, to rape and kill our citizens, and to collect social entitlements. The Latinx we exploit in the US have become so problematized that we need a wall at the southern border that goes from sea to shining sea to keep them out. And we may have suspected it before, but now we know for sure that for some, in the highest echelons of our government, believe that Haiti, African countries, and El Salvador are S-hole countries. Places like Norway are not. And the unexpressed implications are that people from S-hole countries are S-hole people, and those not from S-hole countries are not. Therefore, the latter are welcome, the former are not. So on the basis of appearance, social location, cultural practices, the quality, character, and worth of a people are being determined. This problematizing the existence of those deemed non-white is quintessential white supremacist thinking. And not only is it deeply offensive, it's dangerous to everybody. In June 2015, when Dylan Roof walked into a prayer meeting at the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, he was invited to join the group. But after partaking of 1 hour of their hospitality, he opened fire, killing the pastor, the Reverend Clementa Pinckney, and 8 members of that congregation. That massacre was viewed as an unfortunate incident and treated as an aberration. Roof was deeply influenced by literature espousing the kind of hatred that convinced him that it was not only appropriate but necessary for him to murder in cold blood people he didn't know in their house of prayer. In his mind, top culprits for all that ails whites like him were blacks and Jews. After Charleston, we went on with our lives, and some of us even forgot about it. But I think now we see that such killings are not an aberration, but are events in this climate that are likely to continue unless something is done. We can't afford to turn a blind eye to what is happening to our neighbor and assume that we're safe. This reminds me of the poem attributed to Martin Niemöller, Lutheran pastor in Nazi Germany, who was imprisoned for his resistance to Hitler. The poem has a message for us in our own context. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. When people hear or read that poem, they like to say, wow, isn't that something? Or gee, that's powerful. But Niemöller didn't write this for idle reflection. He wrote it to spur people to action. In late October of this year, when Robert Bowers walked unnoticed into the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, he, like Dylann Roof, had convinced himself that blacks, Jews, and other minorities are destroying his people and a threat to this white nation. So as Jews gathered for prayer and worship of God, he slaughtered 11 men and women in cold blood. They were people like you and me, with gifts and talents given to them to make a positive difference in this world. It's a sad commentary on our times that when we prepare to go to our respective houses of worship, the thought might now occur to us that we too could be sitting targets. A week after the killings at the Tree of Life Synagogue, I accompanied a Jewish neighbor and friend of mine to a Shabbat service. The huge crowd, Jews and non-Jews, had to wait patiently in the drizzling rain while police and security guards examined our bags and backpacks and waved a security wand over us before we could enter the synagogue. During her sermon, the rabbi mentioned that her 11-year-old daughter tearfully begged her not to return to the synagogue. There's something deeply amiss about a society in which children are frightened that loved ones going to worship God could meet a violent, senseless death. I have no prescription for something that will magically cure what ails our society. However, I do think interfaith communities have something constructive to offer. Interfaith engagement can model what it means to love our neighbors, whoever they are, despite our very real theological differences. And why not? Do we not share a desire to love the one who brings us into existence, preserves us in our going out and coming in, and empowers us to love each other? Is that not something we can celebrate and build upon? Do we not recognize the value and worth of every human being? Is the protection of human dignity not a basis upon which we can work together? I also believe that we must commit to walking in solidarity with our religious neighbors. By engaging people across faith lines, we can come to know them as people, people who experience human needs, aspirations, hurts, and vulnerabilities that we also experience. When we come to know them, it is easier to stand in solidarity with them in both favorable and unfavorable times. Standing in solidarity, the stranger can become a friend. I was reminded of this when I heard that the current pastor of Emmanuel AME Church, the Reverend Eric Manning, went to Pittsburgh with a few members of his Charleston congregation to be in solidarity with the worshipers at the Tree of Life Synagogue after their tragic loss. These two faith communities had walked the same road of soul-wrenching sorrow. The folks from Emmanuel AME offered concrete support to a different community of faith during an excruciating moment in that community's life. Such an action bears witness that we can care and recognize that there is a tie that binds us to each other by virtue of being fellow human beings. One of the biggest ways in which interfaith engagement can play a constructive role in disrupting the corrosive effect of hate-inspired rhetoric and discriminatory policies that malign and devalue other people because they are different is prophetic witness. Our communities of faith must embrace their prophetic role in society. They must declare an emphatic no to hatred. By word and deed, they must give a decisive no to the myriad ways in which public speech and action foster self-centeredness, promote egregious disregard for those who are different, and ignore the suffering of others. I hear a lot about the coarseness of our culture and the vitriol exhibited toward others in our public discourse today. And I ask, where is the moral leadership from faith communities that challenges that kind of discourse? Where's the pushback from our faith communities now that lying has become the national pastime? Where is the outrage for a culture that sanctions disrespect for women? Where's the prophetic word denouncing the violations of human rights of those in our backyards? There's no good reason for us to remain locked in our silos when more can be done, can be accomplished by working together. After our crying, commiserating, and dialogue, much more is required of us. We must address the ideology of white supremacy. And here is where whites must do more of the heavy lifting of cleansing this scourge from American society. The role of communities of faith in the public square is to speak truth to the powerful and stand firm in the ethical imperative to promote and safeguard the dignity of those whose dignity is being violated by economic, cultural, social, and political systems that insist upon forging inequalities that make us all unsafe. We must practice upholding human dignity within our respective communities so that we can model this beyond our doors. If we fail to model what we profess, then we deserve to be branded as hypocritical and dismissed as irrelevant. When we dare to cross the lines of division that have been imposed upon us, we discover that we have much more in common than we thought. White supremacy can't take root where people understand that their well-being is tied to that of the other. There is no fertile ground for white supremacy to flourish when we recognize that shared power empowers us all. Freedom comes to all who surrender their fear and embrace siblinghood, the siblinghood that we have as human beings made in the image of God. May we be granted the grace to walk in that freedom. Thank you.
There is nothing more wonderful for a Jew to hear that white supremacy is an anathema to Christian theology. But what's older than white supremacy is Christian supersessionism, the idea that Christianity supersedes or abrogates Judaism. And the quotes that are used to justify violence against Jews that are used by people like Robert Bauer come from the New Testament. And there is a long and tumultuous history of these quotes being used to commit really egregious acts of violence against Jews. Mm-hmm. So when we think about the radicalization of white supremacists in this country, it's hard for us to imagine that radicalization without the language of Christianity and without the language of Christian supersessionism. Mm-hmm. So I would like you to share with us ways in which we can address this problem so that most of us can fully understand how white supremacy can truly be an anathema to the Christian theological imagination.
Oh, what a question.
I started with a softball.
Right, right. There's no question that the problem of supersessionism, the idea that Christianity, in Christianity, the idea that Christians have replaced Jews as the chosen people, has a long and problematic history in the history of Christian thought. I think as Christian theologians have engaged with Jewish theologians, there's been a lot of work done on challenging the notion of supersessionism. The problem is that academic theology takes a long time to make its way into the pews. And depending on where you are, what your religious tradition is within Christianity, the problem can remain. And I think part of the solution in terms of helping us to move forward from that is the notion of religious traditions actually leaders in particular using their opportunities to preach and to teach to correct this way of thinking. And I know that the Catholic Church has been pretty active in trying to combat this theological problem that has created deadly consequences. And I think that's part of where it begins. That's not the only solution, but it's certainly a start. If people don't know, or not told, hey, this is problematic, chances are it remains part of the way congregations think. And so it's incumbent upon us who know better to be mindful of the role of clergy in exercising its prerogative of leadership in order to combat this problem.
Okay, yeah.
Have you had many interactions with white supremacists? And if so, has anything positive come from those interactions?
No, not the kind that would wear signs with vile statements regarding Jews, blacks, and other people. As I said in my lecture, there are two expressions of white supremacy. What I know very well is the kind in which there's a lack of awareness of white privilege and what that means. And I've encountered as well people who have actually engaged me in ways that took me back to the way things were in the 50s and 60s, following me around in the store, refusing to wait on me in stores, looking at me with contempt, or the kind of subtle things you see in terms of parties where people notice that you're one of a few persons of color. They walk up to you, what do you do? As though, you know, what are you doing here is the question behind that. Trying to calculate how it is that a person of color is in the midst of an esteemed group. That kind of subtle way of thinking and interacting where there's the sense of superiority. It's not brandishing torches and that sort of thing, but you know when you're being condescended to. You know when you're being disregarded. You know, and you see it when people, when you meet a person and they ask you, well, what is it you do? then all of a sudden they're very interested when they find out what you do. But before, they're not so interested. And so I haven't had the opportunity to engage the expression of white supremacism that would make me fearful. And I hope that I don't. But thank you for your question.
Last year I made the shocking discovery that my great-grandfather served in the Confederate Army and was shot in the head at the Battle of Cowers Bridge, but fortunately recovered from me because he later had my grandmother. So how should I think of my great-grandfather, and is it wrong to honor him or think kindly of him? It doesn't matter that I'm Jewish.
Your family is your family. We don't choose our relatives. We don't always understand their way of thinking if it's different from our own. You would still love him. I would expect that to be the case. But it would lead you existentially to grapple with that aspect of your history, to try to make sense of it. And it's something that can be done. I mean, you can, that is something to work on. But your family is your family.
Lately, there have been some attacks on the leaders of the Women's March, Tamika Mallory and Linda Sarsour, including coming from the Jewish community. And I was wondering if you could place those in the context of white supremacy and weigh in on what we can do to strengthen the connection between our communities when those attacks are going on.
I thank you for the question and profess that I am not as familiar with that incident as I probably should be. But it seems to me that part of white supremacy involves a kind of lifting up of patriarchy, a lifting up the idea of male dominance that goes along with it, and any resistance to that seems to me where women stand up for their rights, that this would be viewed as something to resist. It's a threat. One of the things that I'm trying to do as I remain immersed in these issues now, it's become something that really does burden my heart. It's not an intellectual kind of endeavor. It is something that's existential for me, is to try to understand. I'm not sure you can, but to try to understand the mindset of people in which they can hold the kind of views and engage in the kinds of actions that they do harm to people whom they perceive as a threat. It reveals to me a high degree of fear and insecurity that's operating. And rather than just scoff at it or just dismiss it or malign people who are part of this, trying to understand what's really going on behind this. It's certainly what we've been seeing in terms of the climate here has increased to the extent that the current administration has kind of given permission for the kind of engagement that we see. And so I think there's not a single way of addressing this, but a social analysis of what exactly is going on. And engaging in ways as you come together in community to try to address not only the immediate and violent and obvious issues, but also to look at what's going on with people. One of the things that I try to do in terms of my work on human dignity is to always keep in mind that we are dealing with human beings created in the image of God. And as hard as that can be sometimes to remember, our solutions to these issues must keep in mind that these people, like other people, are human beings, and we must never descend to their level. And so that's a hard challenge to do that.
I'm a member of this congregation. We have an active anti-racism project here. But I'd like to know, Dr. Mitchell, what would you suggest that people in houses of worship, wherever they may be, kind of things that you would suggest that can be done to address the issue of white supremacy?
Actually, my question was very similar. If we are going to change things locally and start where we live, I wonder what you would say was a way to address in a personal level the denial of white supremacy.
Most people my color do not understand the difference between white supremacy and white privilege. And although I can never fully grasp that because I've never been a person of non-color, half of my family is African American, and they have shared their life experiences with me. And there's a definite difference, and maybe you could clarify a little better the difference between white supremacy and white privilege.
I want to piggyback on the two people who spoke earlier. What can we do more concrete? What would you suggest? One thing that I do, and I have been doing it for a while, and I would encourage others in the congregation to take up the mantle of doing something more concrete. When I write out a bill or I write out something on the back of an envelope, whether you're sending in your gas and electric bill, your cable bill, or whatever it is, I write on there because I see that many women of color are ignored. And I write on there, we're veterans, we're patriots, we are Americans and we are your customers, and you need to recognize us, because I don't see many of us recognized when I look at TV. And if we are used in commercials or in some kind of a show, a lot of it is in a very negative way. I don't see many dark-skinned little girls on there. And when I've talked to people, I've gone to a place where, I don't know whether you know George Steinme or not, but anyway, he was a young black boy that was electrocuted at 14 years of age for raping two white girls, which never happened. But they had a white woman playing his mother. And when I asked about that, oh, she's black. Well, I said, she doesn't look black. And that's the important thing. People always like to, use a mixed person or someone who's extremely light to play that woman of color. We can't see her birth certificate, and it doesn't matter because she looks white. And I just ask you to take on some role, do something. Write to companies. I have written to them, and I have seen changes. And I ask you, make your money count. Whether you're Jewish, whether you're African American, make your money count and remind them that you are their customer.
It's dangerous to try to remember 4 different questions at my stage in life and at this time of the evening, but I will try. The statistic I gave you with regard to Robin DiAngelo noting the degree to which whites control so many areas, an overwhelming number of areas, is part of the issues that we continue to struggle with. Who gets to star in Hollywood pictures? Who gets to be represented in commercials? We're seeing some changes, but I think we have to continue to press on having greater representation of other kinds of people in vast areas of our life. What you're describing is a concrete expression of the way white supremacy works. White worldview, white taste, white culture, white idols, et cetera, et cetera. And so minorities have challenged this, and they continue to challenge this. And I have seen some movements moving forward. But it's going to be a constant battle, and unless and until people have a recognition, not just kind of intellectually, but in the inner person, in the gut, that, hey, something is wrong here, and we need to change. With regard to the three questions related to how communities of faith can begin the work of altering the way in which we address the issue of white supremacy, I think you start small. I think churches that are having discussion groups, reading texts that bring up this issue. I have a former student who is now in a facility or a community for those who are retired, who has taken on the task, and she's white, of engaging folks in that community about the issue of white supremacy. It's often folks want to look to the minorities to do the heavy lifting of challenging white supremacy. And after many years of engagement in interracial dialogue, I'm kind of weary of being in situations where we are asked to resolve these issues. Minorities are not the problem. We've had a Negro problem, an Indian problem. We have a problem of immigrants from non-white countries. The problematizing of communities is something that whites have to look at. It is very hard to ask a minority person to go in a context that's overwhelmingly white and talk about white supremacy. I stopped doing Black History Month sermons because it always felt as though I was giving an annual spanking to people who wanted to be affirmed that they're good people and everything is okay, and I had to put a stop to that. I also I really feel that whites who know better, who understand that it is their responsibility to lead the charge in terms of their own communities on this. But I think, again, It's not as though minorities can't play a role as well, but as I said earlier, we've been doing the heavy lifting, and it's a problem not of our making. And one of the things you do is in small groups have conversations with people about it. Privilege, a lot of people who resist or bristle at the notion of white privilege because even though they are white, they are living paycheck to paycheck, or they're not reaping huge benefits that they can see materially in terms of their whiteness. Need to think for a moment about what it means to make your way in the world where your entry in a place is not questioned, where your IQ is not taken on sight, where you are not made to feel uncomfortable because you're in the midst of another group. Empathetic imagination can go a long way toward helping people to think for a moment about the experiences of minorities.
You mentioned Eric Ward, and I read a piece recently that he wrote where he talked about the provisional privilege that is given to Jews at times when it serves the purpose of white supremacy, and when that's revoked. I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
The question relates to the way in which Jews can, they have reaped in some way the benefits of whiteness, and yet, and still, they are a minority, and the navigation of the being able to pass for white has certain advantages, and they sometimes Jews have accommodated themselves to the larger culture for diverse and various reasons. I don't question someone's decisions about how they make their way in a world that's a racialized society. But I really encourage people to give thought to what side are they going to be on? Are they going to be on the side of the oppressed, or are they going to reap privileges that are denied others who can't pass, who are marked in ways that they are unable to engage? But I appreciate your question.
In your book, Plantations and Death Camps, which we just studied at ICJS, which was a great discussion, by the way, you write the following: the absence of empathetic imagination is the psychological foundation for participation in dehumanizing a fellow human being. How do we go about increasing that empathetic imagination?
Did I really say that? That sounds pretty good. It's in the book. Sensitizing people, teaching children, teaching young people to put themselves in the place of others is an important part of that. Challenging people to think for a minute about walking in the shoes of another or hearing the experiences of another person can go a long way to softening that. I'm not sure whether that's an innate quality or whether it has to be learned. I just know that it seems a lot of people are unable to do that. And so perhaps it does have to be taught. And that's hard work to do because people are resistant to change. They're resistant. There are ways in which we are often very self-centered, very focused on me and mine and what's in my interests. And our culture cultivates and rewards that in many ways. But I think that we have opportunities to impress upon people. I just struggle sometimes with the absence of that, why that is so. That's a tough one. It's a tough one.
I agree with you wholeheartedly that white people need to do the heavy lifting. It is a problem of white people's making. I also am certain that I benefit from white skin privilege. I'm also Jewish. And so sort of thinking about the role of white Jews in dismantling white supremacy, when part of the narrative of white supremacy is that Jews are backing up, lifting people of color at the expense of whites, I'm stuck in this kind of conundrum of the role of we white Jews in that, which is not to say that we're not acting. You have got me thinking about some of the maybe unintended consequences in reinforcing the white supremacist narrative.
I really do appreciate that question. I think that part of this involves us coming to a moment in our lives in which our orientation is going to be that of looking out for the least, the marginalized, the oppressed, and taking sides with that. And once that conviction is raised in a person's mind, and it's a journey, and sometimes it takes some of us a longer time to come to that point. But I think that that's what is absolutely necessary in order to shed privilege, shed the benefits of being provisionally white, shed the privilege that we have in terms of access to opportunities, a kind of kenosis, a shedding of what has come to us or that we've taken, and saying, no, I'm siding with those who are the most needy. And it's out of that then that a whole lot of decisions about how you govern your life start to come into place, where you are confronted at moment after moment about making a choice as to where you stand. And so my hope and prayer is that as people wrestle with this in their own lives, how are they going to live out a way of being with others, being for others, accompanying others, is one that they will have to say that I'm no longer going to revel in the privileges that I now have. And that will mean suffering. That will mean hardship. And it can get you killed. But I don't know any other way in which to live with integrity than to say, I'm siding with those who are in need of people that will accompany them along the way, and see where that takes you. But that's hard. That's very hard. It's a serious decision, and it's not made overnight. But that's what I see needs to happen.